happened at night, either preceding or following sleep. A sort of sensory trance, hard to snap out of, where I lost control of my own thoughts and the perception of the world around me. It's one of the most uncomfortable sensations I've known, and for a long time, I thought I was alone in having it. To this day, it's been hard to explain with only words. I'm awake. Everything is perceived through a rust-red static and a nauseating translucent grid, splitting everything around me into hypercubes of opposites and contrasts. Time moves both fast and slow at the same time. Everything feels at once both massive and microscopically small, violently loud and deadly quiet, close and distant, aggressive and gentle. All matter around me is continuously cycling back and forth between opposite extremes of perception. There's a horror in the seemingly impossible contrasts. On top of all this comes the sense of a presence, a notion of extreme urgency, and an inner silent scream. Thoughts and mental images become warped and aggressive. It did gradually stop as I got older, and I forgot about it. It was probably just me anyway.
Yeah, I had to explain it to some close relatives without sounding crazy and without worrying them because, if you have it, it's like, oh yeah, like, there it is again. But if you have to explain it, like, are you good? Are you okay?
Agis have been experiencing the recently discovered phenomenon of tachysensia all his life. The name refers to symptoms of contrasts in time perception.
Everything is slower, but it's more violent in terms, like it's more vivid, not vivid, like it's more robust. Every movement seems more violent. My movements seem really fast, but like not everything slows down. Maybe I feel more sped up. When I was younger, it felt like someone screaming in my head. And when I tried to explain it to my father, I was worrying that he would think that like I'm like either possessed or schizophrenic or something. Not an actual voice, but like I felt as if someone was screaming in my head, not hearing someone, but as like the tension of it. you get something as a child, and you go to your parents and you ask, like, you know, am I gonna be okay? Like, what's happening? Somehow, I found out about the name. After getting the name, I googled it, and then the subreddit came up.
I was getting people who were Googling their own symptoms, getting pointed to my post in r/neuro, and then they were messaging me. I have, like, if you go through my IMs, personal messages on Reddit, it's like person after person after person who was sending me a message saying, I experienced the same thing, and they were just very excited, I guess, that they finally found somebody else who could describe it. And that's kind of what prompted me after about 2 or 3 years of getting all of these instant messages. I was like, I need to create a community for all these people because there was obviously a need for it. People who don't know what's going on or people who have a little bit more anxiety, just knowing that there's other people out there. It definitely is something that's kinda isolating because when you try and talk to people about it, you always get that, "We have no idea what you're talking about." Whether it's your parents, siblings, doctors, psychologists, it's just so unknown that really that's always what people end up with is nobody knows what they're talking about. So, most people can't even comprehend that time can be perceived differently. And so when you go through something where you suddenly are perceiving time in a completely different way than normally and you are aware of it, how do you describe that to somebody? It's like telling somebody, can you imagine a color that doesn't exist?
While tachysensia seems to affect mostly the perception of time, there is another disorder that affects other senses as well. And the more personal accounts about tachysensia I read, the more it became apparent that it seems to be a subtype of this other, more all-encompassing disorder.
Later in life, I developed some Alice in Wonderland symptoms as well. And then, as I kept reading, I found out that those two are actually related. People and things seem to be further away. Someone might be, at my reach. I know that, but at the same time, they feel as if they're at the end of a long corridor. It's more feeling based. It's not a delusion or something. Like, you don't actually think that they are further away. Like, I know that I can touch them, but at the same time, they seem far away. It's really weird.
One thing that all of these different things have in common is the change in the perception of time. That kind of stays persistent when you're having an episode. People with Alice in Wonderland, they, experience seeing things bigger or smaller than normal, or they will sometimes say, that their fingers feel fat or thin, or when they touch things, that those things feel fat or thin. For them, it's like a very much a tactile change in their sense of their tactile change and visual. I think tachysensia affects the sense of time as well as Alice in Wonderland, but then it's more auditory. And then there's people who experience that inner voice change, which I've never really thought of like the inner voice as being a sense in itself, but it's kind of just interesting. I can see why people who experience that would have more anxiety because of, all of the scary stereotypes around auditory hallucinations, I guess. Schizophrenia and things like that come to mind. But it's good to know that that's not necessarily related in any way to schizophrenia.
Up until recently, there had been little information online about both Alice in Wonderland Syndrome and Tachysensia. The last few years, more articles and statistics have started popping up, and in 2019, the book Alice in Wonderland Syndrome was published by Jan-Dirk Blom, professor of clinical psychopathology and specialist in rare perceptual disorders. In his 2016 article Alice in Wonderland Syndrome, A Systematic Review, a survey reveals that as much as 30% of the general population is reported to have experienced non-clinical symptoms. I had to reach out to him, and he was kind enough to answer some questions via email. I wanted to ask him why he thinks it's taken so long for the condition of Alice in Wonderland Syndrome to be recognized, when such a large number of people are experiencing symptoms.
And like for a lot of people, I feel like a lot of children, like it, maybe like 100 years ago, 200 years ago, they might, probably they were sent for exorcism or something like that, and then the kids learned to not talk about it. But yeah, like it must have been really weird for people in the older days, where you could barely talk about your feelings at that point, let alone a rare neurological condition.
No one has been officially diagnosed with tachysensia because it is so new, because it is a term that originated on our boards. Right now, I think it's so fresh and so new in the scientific community that people are just kind of starting to become aware of it. I don't think that there's any official diagnosis that I've ever heard of. But I would love to know when the first person gets diagnosed with it. I don't know. Like, it's weird for me to say, but it's kind of like an exciting thing, just to see that, it's now known. The thing that I think is really cool is even parents, who have kids describe this to them now, they start Googling it and they find our community and they'll make posts, my kid is telling me about this, what do I do? What should I say to them? What resources? And there isn't a whole lot that we can really point them to, and we always do, of course, say if it's a really big concern, to a medical professional. But we are at least able to give a little bit of peace of mind that other people are experiencing this, that there's no long-term or short-term medical things we necessarily need to be worried about with it, that we are aware of. Picture a falcon diving out of the air, however fast they do, at ridiculous speeds, trying to catch that prey in the middle of the air. Does that falcon experience time in the same way that we do? For somebody who has never experienced time differently, you don't really think about other um, animals, creatures, or other people being able to experience time in a different way that you do. It's kind of like, this is how I experience it, and I assume it's like that for everybody else. But for me, it's kind of not the same. I think, do different animals experience time differently? From an insect to a bird to whatever, Um, and that is kind of like how I think about consciousness, slightly different now, as more of an individually experienced thing than something that we necessarily all experience the same.